point, we are reaching the 1-year anniversary of collective trauma. And if you haven't had a quarantine birthday yet, you'll get one soon. That affects our brains in ways that we're still understanding. So very much adjustment, which takes a tremendous amount of emotional, mental, and physical energy. If you are feeling dead tired right now, you are not alone. That has become a bit of a norm for us. We've been hit with a tsunami of grief, but if we don't have the bandwidth or the support to be able to lean into that and process our grief, our sadness might be showing up as anger, maybe even very visceral anger right now. And we've all been using our preferred method of choice to try to manage all that. But at some point, sometimes those resources start to fail us. It's just too much. It just overwhelms the system. And so today, I thought we might take some time to look at some ways to be able to process, identify our emotions, and be able to find some resolution to them, which can help to free up some margin and also can allow us to continue this path in a way where we feel that we have a little more space, that we feel that we are able to better manage our relationships, and of course, better manage what's internally going on inside of us. Okay, so I used to be a school teacher. Sorry, I'm taking these off. I think they're banging. I used to be a school teacher. So we're going to take an approach today that is part psychoed, but we're also going to leave a significant amount of time for personal processing. So if you have paper and pen nearby, that will probably be helpful for you if you'd like to. I'm going to ask some questions and give us some time to do some thinking around some of the things that we're talking about, ample opportunity to pause and reflect. And sometimes that can be helpful for us to be able to write those things down as we're doing that. So if you'd like to have some paper and something to write with nearby, that could be helpful. And then as Gwen mentioned, we'll also leave a good amount of time at the end for Q&A, because I would like for this to be a communal lunch and learn together. We all learn so much from each other. And so we want to make sure that we allow opportunity for that. All right, let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, Gwen, can you give me the okay that you all can see that?
We can.
Good?
Yep.
You cannot. You can?
We can. Yep. Looks
all
good.
Right. All right. We're off and running then. Okay. Our outline today is going to follow a basic equation for change. And you'll see that I've underlined 3 A's: increased awareness, focused attention, and deliberate action. So we'll start off with increasing our awareness. What are emotions? What role do they play for us? And then we're going to take a little bit of time focusing our attention on that. Whenever we are able to focus our attention on something, it allows a new neural pathway in our brain to be that much more able to change, that much more able to form, to connect. So we're going to spend some significant time focusing our attention on how each of us interact with our own emotions. And then the last part of the change equation is deliberate action. So we'll look at some tools to grow our skills in practicing emotional agility. And that's the case for all new things in life, right? Is practice, practice, practice. That's how those neural pathways are formed. It's how they're reinforced. It's how they're grooved. And that's how things get wired. So we'll spend some time looking at that as well. Okay, let's look at just some basics. What exactly are emotions? Well, guess what? There's currently no scientific consensus on a definition. So that's not particularly helpful, but there are a few things we do No, emotions are biological states associated with all of the nerve system brought on by neurophysiological changes. So that means it involves both mind and body. Neurophysiological changes variously associated with thoughts, feelings, behavioral responses, and there's a degree of pleasure or displeasure. There's some helpful information there. I don't know about you, but I prefer things a little more simplified. So if we were to look at a more general definition, emotions are data. They tell us when something needs to be adjusted. They're like the control panel on our car. When I am looking at my car dashboard and I see one of the panels start, one of the control panels start to move, the gauge starts to move, let's say my radiator, it tells me, hey, there's something here that needs to be adjusted. It's data for me. It's information for me. If it's my radiator, it tells me you need to add water. You're overheating right now. If it's my oil gauge, it tells me, hey, you're getting low on oil. You're gonna break down soon. Put some oil in. Emotions are just like that. They are data for our internal state. They also evoke motion. And I really like, this is an easy way to remember the emotions, just the E at the beginning of evoke, they evoke motion. They generate motion. They generate movement. One of the easiest ways that we can observe that happening is our fight, flight, freeze response, okay? If there is a speeding train coming down the track and I'm in the way, I feel fear, the emotion of fear. And my brain immediately evokes motion. It immediately tells me, run. I don't make that decision. It happens automatically. It is telling me something internally that needs to be adjusted, and it evokes motion. Now, not all of our emotional responses are that simple. So let's take a quick look at what's happening in our brains as a result of our emotions. Okay, as I mentioned, I used to be a school teacher. So one of my favorite teaching tools are children's books. And anytime we can put the cookies on the lower shelf, as I like to say, I think it increases retention. It increases the stickiness for us to be able to connect something familiar to something unfamiliar. And quite frankly, we probably also could all use a little levity in our lives right now. So I appreciate you indulging me in this. We're going to look at a couple of pages from a book called Toby the Tiger Tamer. If you have little ones around you, this is an excellent resource to help them understand what's going on in their little brains right now. So many overwhelming emotions for our children right now as well. And this book does a wonderful job of explaining what's going on and helping all of us, quite frankly, feel a little more in control of what's going on internally. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of act like three main parts of our brain. We're going to refer to them as different animals. We're going to refer to our amygdala as a tiger, our prefrontal cortex as an owl, like a wise thinking owl, and our hippocampus, we're going to refer to that as a hippo. So we have a tiger, a hippo, and an owl. And all of us have these three parts in our brains. Generally, most of the time, they work together pretty well. Sometimes they don't. And a lot of the times, emotion is what can hijack that process and create sort of a spiral effect that may result in unintended actions or unintended consequences. Okay, The tiger, the amygdala, is the emotional center of our brain. This is where our emotions are most raw and most tender. Now, our tiger's job is to keep us safe. It is the radar for threat in our brain. It's also the trigger for strong emotional responses. Now, we really benefit from that. Like I mentioned earlier, if there is a speeding train coming from me, I want my tiger to wake up immediately and get me out of the way. I want that response, that amygdala response in my brain to keep me safe. Now, when our tiger is awake and roaring, our hippo goes underwater and our owl flies away. Some of you may have experienced during this last year difficulty concentrating, difficulty remembering, difficulty learning something new. This is because our tigers have been awake a lot over the past year. Our tigers have been assessing for threats over and over and over again. And when that happens, it's more difficult for the thinking brain, our owl, to work together with it. And it's more difficult for the hippo. If we were to say that our hippo has a big mouth, it can take in new information to let our tiger know, hey, this is safe or this isn't safe. It's difficult when our tiger is roaring for those other parts to be able to work together. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this happens automatically. So if we get overwhelmed by big emotional intensity, it can shut down our ability to objectively and rationally process what's going on. And it can affect our ability to be able to take in information around us that can help our tigers know, hey, this is safe or this isn't safe. If you've ever been in a fight with someone you love, you understand this concept very well. If someone says to you, you're not thinking straight right now, see, now you can respond with, exactly, the biological impossibility for me to think straight right now. My tiger is awake and roaring, there is emotional intensity, and my owl has flown away. Something else for us to remember is that when our tiger wakes up a lot, he becomes a very light sleeper. So again, if we think over the course of the past year, how many times our tiger has woken up to keep us safe? At this point, our tigers are probably pretty much awake all the time. Additionally, every thought that we experience has an emotion attached to it. So not only is our tiger monitoring our external worlds for threats, when we have thoughts associated with what we are seeing and that information we're taking in, there's emotion attached to that as well. And the way that we construct our universe is deeply dependent on our emotional states at that time, our emotional states when we are having those thoughts, when we are processing those thoughts. And so our thinking is actually driven by our feelings, not the other way around. So even something like thinking, well, I'm not being treated fairly right now, that can cascade a whole flood of reactions in our brains that affects our tiger, our hippo, and our owl. And when we have that cascade of reaction in our brain, it also affects our bodies as well. So we can see how when we're having a lot of this emotional intensity swirling around, it can make things a little bit difficult to feel like, how do I get control of this? So since we mentioned that this can also affect our bodies, let's pause for a quick second and let's just look at that connection. Many of us realize already that emotional suppression can result in stomach aches, or irritable bowel syndrome or headaches. Studies have also found that when we experience emotion, especially anxiety, fear, anger, the more tender and raw those emotions are, the more constricted our muscles become, which can cause muscle fatigue and also muscle inefficiency over time. A lot of us have been trying to keep up our workouts during this past year, and we're so thankful for all of the trainers at BDI and all of the wonderful classes. I'm sure that I am not alone in recognizing, wow, it just feels really difficult sometimes to do exercises that I was doing with ease before the pandemic started. Part of that is the emotional intensity, the emotional load that we have been bearing over the past year. Now, if we're talking about traumatic experiences, which at this point, it's appropriate to call this past year a collective trauma, the body remembers those experiences. Remember, we said that so much of our world is constructed by our emotional experiences at the time. Our body remembers when we experience those emotions. The body keeps the score, which is another excellent resource, another book by Bessel van der Kolk, if you're looking to understand more of the bodily response to our emotions. And even after the traumatic event may be over, the body still has a difficult time returning to a normal, relaxed state. So our bodies still stay in survival mode. Our stress hormones can still stay very elevated. That instantly releases cortisol, which can cause an increase in our blood sugar and blood pressure. That has a negative effect on our body's immune system, which in effect can cause difficulty in healing, for example, chronic conditions. So again, we can understand how these emotional experiences can cascade into a very complex and holistic response that's actually affecting not just our minds, not just our brains, but our bodies in very complex ways as well. I want to speak a little bit more to things like chronic pain. When it comes to things like chronic pain, whether or not the trauma was connected to the event or the condition that even originated the pain, having a chronic pain condition or a chronic health condition is traumatizing in and of itself. If we think of the amount of emotion that becomes attached to experiencing and living through a chronic pain condition or a chronic illness, that is traumatizing in and of itself. And even if we find ourselves, like we mentioned, putting the traumatic event behind us, or feeling that we are finding additional healing from a chronic condition, our brains emotionally may still feel unresolved. And so the body clings to those unresolved emotional issues as well. We may be doing all of the right things in order to heal physically, but if there's still unresolved emotion, our bodies can cling to that. And that may be an additional part of the puzzle that needs to be unlocked in order for us to complete that cycle and find wellness. So if we take all that into account, the tiger and the hippo and the owl, and understanding where our emotions begin and how that emotional intensity can affect our ability to think, our ability to take in information. It explains to us why we cannot think our way out of an emotion. If my tiger is awake, I cannot use my owl to think my way out of that because it's flown away. We have to meet it where it started. I can't just stop it. If anyone has ever, just stop feeling angry, just stop feeling sad. It's a biological impossibility. We have to meet it where it started. And so again, what that means, when our tiger is awake, when our emotions have hijacked our brains, we do what comes most easily, which is generally what we've practiced the most. We carry out our automatic brain pattern, our automatic neural response. And that is probably something more immature than we would like to admit. It could be something, if we have the thought, oh, I'm not being treated fairly right now, our automatic response might be, well, I really like to hit this person right now. We've all been there. We all might still be there. It might be, I want to scream obscenities right now, or I want to throw my phone against the wall. I want to break something. And that is a response. It could be an automatic brain pattern to that emotional intensity. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a very curious look inward at maybe what some of our automatic responses might be. Because as we said in our very first slide, we don't want to suppress our emotions. We don't want to avoid them. We don't want to squelch them or push them down because they're really important data for us. They are very important wisdom for us that tell us when a need is being met or when a need is not being met. They tell us when something needs to be adjusted. So we definitely want our emotions in the car with us. We just don't want them in the driver's seat. Because when they're in the driver's seat, that can cause the biological response of our owl to fly away, our hippo to go underwater, and prevents us from being able to objectively work through and resolve that particular situation. Okay, let's take a second there and let that kind of sit in for a second. So if all of these things are happening in our brains and our body, what do we do with that? First thing is to hit pause. In the sentiment of Viktor Frankl, he says, between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. So when we hit pause, we give ourselves a space. And Viktor Frankl goes on to say, in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And that's why we're all here today, right? We're looking to grow. So the first step is to take a pause. What that pause does is it allows us to start to tame our tiger. It allows that automatic amygdala response to start to come down. Sometimes our emotions are so intense, we need to combine the pause with a grounding exercise. And you might be familiar with that term. Grounding exercises are simply something that allows us to be cognizant and pay attention to our bodies and where we are in the present moment, in the here and now. It interrupts that response that's happening in our limbic system, that's happening with our tiger. And it allows us to recognize, I'm here in the present moment, and we're telling our tiger, in effect, hey, you're safe. Thanks, tiger, for waking up to keep me safe. I'm telling you through this grounding exercise, we're safe. That might look like taking a drink of water. It might look like taking a long, slow breath. Deep breathing is a wonderful way to interrupt that response and help our tigers to start to calm down. What really interrupts the response is slow breathing. So if we're taking a deep breath, it can be incredibly helpful to take the deep breath and pause for just a second and hold our breath for a second, and then to exhale. And that adds that incorporates the element of deep and slow breathing, which can help tame our tigers. It might look like, one of my favorites is just to press my big toe into the floor. It lets my amygdala, that limbic system response, know, hey, I'm very aware that I am feeling my big toe pushing onto the floor. I'm literally grounded, feeling the ground under my feet. And that can help to bring down that response as well. Now, I also want to add that for some of us, these emotional responses may be so intense, especially in the instance of acute trauma. And if that is an indication that it may be necessary to work through some of this process together with a counselor or a therapist to help process those emotions in a very safe and supported place. So I want to add that caveat. All right, so after we have taken a pause, we've grounded ourselves, we've tamed our tiger a little bit, our next step is to name it. This is a feelings wheel. And it is one of my very favorite tools to use to increase emotional vocabulary, emotional agility, emotional intelligence. As you can see, we are a complex and sophisticated people. There are a lot of emotions on this wheel. As you can also notice, these are emotions that we might experience when our needs are not being met. And these are emotions that we might experience when our needs are being met. Now, I want to make sure that everyone can access this after the webinar. So Gwen, maybe at some point during the Q&A, I could put a link to this in the chat, and that way everyone can be able to keep that in their browser. It can even be helpful to keep a screenshot of this on our phone so that we can access it in the moment. Being able to quickly and easily be able to name this, it's a skill. And as we mentioned at the beginning, developing a new skill takes practice. And so when we have these tools available to us at the ready, it can allow those neural pathways to form more easily, to form more quickly, and for us to notice a difference more readily as well. All right, so whatever we are feeling, the number one, after we've taken a pause, after we've grounded ourselves, the number one need is to name it. Here is why. We all tend to use very broad brushstrokes to describe our emotions. I recently heard some research that the majority of people, when asked to name the emotions they regularly feel, they can only name 3: happy, sad, and pissed. The problem is that's too amorphous for our brains and our bodies, as we've discussed, because there is such a connection between that. And so when we use those amorphous, non-specific terms to describe what we're feeling, our brains don't really know what to do with that. When we can become more specific with our language, it can help us better determine exactly what we need to do to adjust that panel, like our car panel. It can help us to better identify and know exactly what needs to be adjusted. it also, when we're able to put language to an emotion, it moves it from the part of the brain where those emotions are raw and tender. It moves it to the part of the brain where we can feel that we have more control over that emotion. And when we use the feelings wheel to do that, we tend to choose language that we would never come up with on our own. And again, that allows us to fine-tune the process even further. Naming something helps us to find our way through it. That's true with our stories just in general. When we can find the right language to describe what we've experienced, that can help us to find our way through it. And it's particularly true in interacting with our emotions. Like I mentioned, it moves the emotional experience from the explicit memory, that part of our brain that's simply raw, tender emotion. It moves it sorry, I said that backwards. It moves it from implicit to explicit memory, which helps us to feel that we have more control over it. It gives us more agency. Often you may have noticed for yourselves, I'm sorry, we're gonna have to pause real quick. I forgot to plug in my computer and my battery is gonna die. Give me just 1 second.
While Emily's doing that, you all, we'll send you the link to the feelings wheel afterwards, so you don't have to worry about capturing it. We'll get it out to you after the presentation, so you all will have it if you would like it.
Thank you so much, Gwen, for that.
Yep.
Okay, let's get this. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, let's continue on. So, as we were saying, when we're able to put language to it, it can allow us to feel that we have more control over our emotions. It gives us more agency. Often, for all of us, we may have noticed during this past season, during this past year, that we have felt a very acute sense of wanting to control what's going on around us, what's going on externally. Often we feel that more strongly when we feel that we do not have control of what's going on internally, what's going on inside of us. And vice versa, when we feel that we have more control over what we're experiencing internally, we are less compelled to control what's going on externally. And naming our emotions is a tremendous tool to have in our toolbox to give us a sense of that greater internal control. Without the language to describe, communicate, or organize our emotions, we're more reactive, like an infant. If we think of a baby, how does a baby tell us when they have an unmet need? Wailing, right? Rage crying. It is the only way the baby knows how to express the emotion, and also the only way the baby knows how to steward emotions to get needs met. This is also why expression of emotion doesn't necessarily make the emotion go away. If that was the case, violence would allow us to resolve our emotions. Punching a wall, it might feel a little bit better in the moment, but as far as sustainable resolution of our emotions, it doesn't quite hit the mark. We don't want to react. We want to respond. Being able to respond instead of react, that's our superpower. And naming our emotions is an essential part of making that shift. Now, I want to make a very important distinction. It's very nuanced, but it's extremely important. Let's say that I'm experiencing some sadness, had a tremendous amount of loss recently, and I'm experiencing some sadness. The way I want to put language to this is to say, I feel sad instead of I am sad. Otherwise, that gives my mind and body the impression that I am the emotion. It's different from I'm feeling an emotion. Now it becomes I am the emotion. When I can make that distinction between I feel sad or I am sad, and again, it's very nuanced, but it's powerful. When I can make that distinction, I recognize I'm no longer owned by the emotion. It's just that the emotion is part of me. It's data for me. I'm not owned by it. It's data for me. I'm noticing what my emotions are telling me about my current state, about what I need, and about where I might need adjustments. Emotions are true. They are true, but they're not always capital T truth. They don't have to define my reality. They're like a wave that moves in, breaks on the shore, stays for a second, and then moves back out to sea. And so the idea is, as we grow and mature, we become more adept at using language to recognize what we're feeling, to recognize, hey, these emotions are telling me something. It doesn't define who I am. I'm not owned by the emotion. It's giving me wisdom, and it's letting me know where my needs are being met or are not being met. And so as we grow in being able to describe that, we can better meet our needs. But truthfully, hardly any of us are actually trained how to even begin to interact with naming some of these emotions. So let's look at why is that. There's a number of reasons. Some of that is we have internalized messages from society. For example, certain cultures tend to communicate both overt and covert messages that it's acceptable for certain genders to feel certain emotions, and it's unacceptable for other genders to feel certain emotions. Depending on which countries you've lived in, or your ethnicity, or which culture that you grew up in or reside in, that may have affected a level of comfort with certain emotions. Or maybe no one modeled for you how to engage with emotions in a way that you felt comfortable putting language to it. So there could be a number of reasons why there are certain categories on this wheel that may feel a little more uncomfortable or unfamiliar than others. So I want to stop for a second, and we're going to camp out here. And this is where, if you have some paper and pen nearby, I'm just going to ask some questions. And I'd like you to interact with the wheel a little bit. And as we've said, this is the bravest work that we will ever do, the bravest and most courageous work that we will ever do, to look inward and really see, how am I engaging with my emotions? Okay, I'd like to start with, take a look at the wheel and ask, which emotions do you tend to believe are good or bad? Let's just start there. Which emotions make you more uncomfortable to witness others feeling? Which emotions do you say are strong or weak? Acceptable or unacceptable? Positive or negative? Are there emotions that you tend to judge yourself for feeling? I shouldn't be feeling sad right now. I shouldn't be feeling angry right now. Now, all of us have experienced positive and negative consequences to how we've stewarded our emotions. And for sure, the way we go about getting our needs met can be very unhealthy. It can, the way we steward our emotions can harm us, and it can harm others. But emotions themselves aren't the problem. we may have conflated that during our lifetime. For example, if you ever heard stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about, developmentally, we're unable to extricate the actual emotion that we were feeling from our inability to understand and recognize what our emotion was trying to tell us. And so what we do is we end up mixing all that together, and then we just internalize the message, well, feeling sad is unacceptable. And voila, we're on our way to a lifetime of resisting sadness. And also probably feeling uncomfortable if others around us are feeling sad as well, which means that I'm ignoring really important data that sadness is trying to tell me about my current state and my current needs. Even more so, denying our feelings is denying part of my humanity. I can't cut off feeling sad or afraid or angry and still expect my capacity for joy, love, and trust to remain the same. It limits my capacity to feel all my emotions when I limit my capacity to feel some of my emotions. Also, we sometimes tend to fear certain emotions because we're afraid if we begin to feel it, we'll never stop. But the opposite is actually true. What we resist persists. Resistance of the painful experience actually fuels it, which makes us resist even more and gets us stuck in a recurring pattern. And really, when we tell ourselves we're afraid of feeling a certain emotion, what's actually happening is we're afraid to be alone with that emotion. And so again, tuning into what we're feeling makes us that much more adept at being able to be vulnerable with a safe person in order to feel it, to heal it. And you'll see these are 3 ways that easy sayings to kind of remember what we're talking about around this feelings wheel. So resisting emotion is what leads to maladaptive behaviors with unwanted consequences. Pushing aside or bottling it up can be associated with high levels of depression and anxiety, lower levels of problem solving, and lower levels of relational effectiveness. Because when we suffocate emotions, we're not able to be authentically vulnerable with people. We probably all have a preferred method for resisting our emotions. Eating or drinking, distracting myself. Sometimes coping skills aren't necessarily bad, but if that's the only way that I know how to engage with my emotions, it creates a cycle where I'm dependent on that coping skill. If I feel anxious and I try to distract myself by watching Netflix, my brain, my tiger, says, whew, good job. Okay, you feel safe again. Now, the next time I feel anxious, my tiger is going to wake up and say, hey, let's do that again. Let's feel safe again by avoiding that emotion again, but let's do it quicker this time. If the only way I know how to respond to my fear is to down a bag of gummy worms, which, confession, that's definitely happened for me over the past year, then that's going to eventually bring some unintended consequences as well. It can be fine in a crisis, but for sustainable change, we want to resolve the emotion. We want to move through the emotion. Okay, let me check my time here. Okay, another way that we can resist certain emotions is positivity. Anathema, you say. Susan David has become one of my favorite researchers as of late. She's part of the faculty at Harvard Medical School. She's the author of a book called Emotional Agility. She also has an excellent TED Talk if you are interested. And she speaks to how so much around us tells us to just get on with it and just be positive. Some of you may have even heard the term toxic positivity starting to float around. We tend to tell ourselves that denial of our actual experience makes us stronger. There is zero research to uphold that. What we're doing in actuality is we're living in a world, when we do that, we're living in a world as we wish it was, not in the world as it is. And what does research tell us about that? Research tells us that the way to respond most effectively and to problem solve most effectively is when we deal with the world as it is, with acceptance. And so if I tell myself just be positive, It may show up as, oh, I shouldn't be feeling lonely or sad. So many people have it worse than me. I'm denying my own reality in that. Now, is it healthy to practice gratitude? Absolutely. In fact, research also tells us that practicing gratitude changes our brains. And the more we practice gratitude, the more easy it is to continue to practice gratitude. But if we're doing that to the exclusion of other emotions, to the exclusion of fully exploring and naming and feeling our whole range of emotions, we're self-sabotaging, and we're actually limiting our capacity to resolve that emotion. So I'm not making myself more emotionally resilient. I'm actually making myself more emotionally fragile. All right, so name it to tame it. What I resist persists, and feel it to heal it. And I know we spent a lot of time on this, but it's to really emphasize this is such a powerful tool to have in our toolboxes. All right, Gwen, I have some additional exercises we can do, but I want to go ahead and stop for some questions at this point as well, just to make sure we're honoring everybody's time.
I think that makes good sense, Emily.
Okay.
We do have one already in the Q&A, but
Okay.
if you all would at this time like to go and find your Q&A icon and put any additional questions that you might have in the Q&A channel, then we can share them with Emily. The first one, Emily, is the writer of Emotional Agility. Who was that?
Susan David, David.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The other thought I'm having, Emily, is that as you and I have discussed, it would probably be wonderful to schedule another webinar to maybe take a look at some of the exercises that you've already identified. I think that would be really, really nice.
Okay.
Somebody else, Emily, has asked if you're trained in the Bowen family systems.
Somewhat. Regina Pecci, who is also on our counseling team, is trained in Bowen family systems, and she's my supervisor. So I'm learning tremendously from her. And boy, do emotions make things spicy when it comes to family systems, don't they?
And just so that you know, we have some people that have already acknowledged they would love the idea of doing more of this, Emily.
Oh, good. I'm glad that it's resonating.
Emily, can you say a little bit more about resolving feeling?
Yes, you mean as sort of along the lines of what that might look like? How do we know when we've resolved a feeling? It can be difficult. It can be difficult, especially if this is a new skill for us. You know, for some of us, even just taking a look at this feelings wheel is a confusing first step. Remember when we talked about how our body remembers our emotional experiences? Bodily sensations often tell us what we're feeling first before our minds can even recognize it. So as you're exploring this, it might be easier to kind of experience or ask, what am I experiencing in my body right now? Maybe for you, your first sign that you're feeling fear is your stomach tightens up, or first sign to feel anger is my fists start to clench, or I can feel my muscles start to be tight. So one of the ways that we can tell if we have moved to resolving that emotion is we can also notice the difference in our body. Sometimes, you know, we can feel tightness in our neck or our jaw. And as we become more adept at being curious instead of judgmental about the emotions that we're experiencing, we become more adept at connecting. Oh, yep, I know exactly. I'm feeling some tension in my neck. That means that I am feeling insecure right now. So as we practice that, sometimes that can be a really helpful way. Movement is also another way to help us fully process the emotions, it can be helpful to unlock certain experiences. And when we pair that with naming our emotions, that can help us to move through and resolve. And things like yoga and dance can be incredibly helpful in fully resolving those emotions.
Thanks, Emily. One other question. Does it make sense that someone could feel the same kind of emotion, for instance, a yellow or sad, and not so much of other types of feelings?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As we mentioned, sometimes when certain emotions have, I like to call it, they've needed a little extra first aid. They've needed a little extra tender care. If that has not happened, then that emotion can take up more residence and take up more space. And what can happen is our capacity for joy or our capacity for trust can become diminished. And so there are exercises that we can do to increase, like one of the ways that we would increase our capacity to feel sadness would be a grieving process. There are also additional exercises that we can do to increase our capacity to feel joy. And so, as we mentioned, these are all interconnected. We are beautifully interconnected in that way. And so, yes, absolutely. It's also possible to when we start doing work with the feelings wheel, to recognize kind of feeling two emotions at once. I may be feeling afraid, and I also may be feeling a little bit intrigued, or I may be feeling angry, and I may also be feeling a little bit proud. And so that's where the curiosity comes in instead of the judgment, because it's data for us. Hey, there's a need here that's not being met, and what can I do to adjust that? And Gwen, actually, I want to show one more slide. Another way that we can move through and resolve is once we've identified the emotion, now the next question is, all right, what do I need now? Sadness might be telling me I need to cry. Shame might be telling me I need self-compassion. Anger is a very big one. Anger might be telling me I need to check in with my boundaries. Is there something here that needs to be protected that is not being protected? And so we can understand if any of these are being avoided or suppressed. This is really important data to allow us to be able to regulate and move to wellness.
It looks like we don't have any other questions. So in an effort to be respectful of the time commitment that we asked everyone to make, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We will send you the link, as we promised, to the feelings wheel. And I'll let Emily make any final remarks or say goodbye.
Yeah, I just want to, again, commend everyone for joining in. It's wonderful to learn from each other. And I'm excited for your journey as you interact with emotions.